Podcasting Q&A for July 24th, 2017. I am Daniel J. Lewis from the Audacity-to-podcast.com. Thank you very much for joining me. I've got several questions lined up here about getting your podcast on iHeartRadio, as well as how to encode your podcast from GarageBand, a question about Spreaker stats, a question about trademarks, and a question about WordPress.org, in addition to whatever questions might come up during this live stream. I do this live on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern over at the Audacity-to-podcast.com/live. So if you're watching live, feel free to post a comment or question, and I'll try to respond to that during this recording. I want to start off answering this question from Scott Orr. Scott said, our podcasts are hosted on Spreaker. The metrics include both plays and downloads. We get a lot more plays than downloads, 2 to 3 times more. Is this a problem? Should we be doing more to encourage people to download rather than to play? And how would we do this anyway? Well, thanks for the question, Scott. Spreaker is multiple things for you. So Spreaker is kind of like SoundCloud in that it's a social platform for hosting audio. Now, Spreaker is far more mature than SoundCloud probably ever will be in terms of podcast hosting. But when it comes to the stats that you see on Spreaker, there are a couple different things to keep in mind with the stats that you see. The plays are generally people who play the episode through Spreaker or through the Spreaker app. Downloads are those who, well, either they're subscribed to your podcast RSS feed that you're providing from Spreaker and they're downloading it that way, or they're downloading it through the Spreaker app and they've clicked download instead of clicking play. If your podcast is primarily hosted on Spreaker and it's not hosted anywhere else, and the RSS feed that you're creating and using that you've submitted to iTunes and other podcast apps is this RSS feed that Spreaker gives you, then it is a little bit odd that your downloads are lower than your plays are. And you can certainly ask the Spreaker team for more clarification on what these different statistics actually mean. But in general, its plays are plays through the Spreaker platform, their website or the app, and downloads are everything else. Does this really matter that much? Well, with Spreaker being a social platform on its own, people do kind of like on SoundCloud, they will browse different sections of Spreaker and listen through Spreaker or through the Spreaker app. But the nature of podcasting and podcasts is that you subscribe to them and the episodes download automatically. So I would encourage you to encourage your audience to subscribe through a podcast app. So that assumes that you have your podcast submitted to Apple Podcasts and the other podcast apps out there, and that you've used your RSS feed to get your podcast into these different apps and directories. If you haven't submitted your podcast feed to these other apps and directories, then it would make perfect sense why your Spreaker play numbers are higher than your download numbers, because you're not downloadable anywhere other than directly through Spreaker, and through Spreaker, people tend to prefer the play experience. Now, using my own stats, for example, when I look at all of the podcasts from my network that are on Spreaker, I'm not using Spreaker as the main media host for those podcasts. But I'm also not using Spreaker to generate the RSS feed for those podcasts. To me, Spreaker is an additional distribution point for those shows. And when I look in my stats in Spreaker, I also see that the plays are significantly higher than the downloads. What Spreaker hasn't really revealed is whether these plays count for any time someone clicks play, or do they have to listen for a certain amount of time before something is considered a play. In most other platforms, that's the way it splits it out. The plays are through that platform. Downloads are downloading the file directly. And in my case, with Spreaker being an additional distribution point, I look at the numbers, but I'm not really concerned that my plays on Spreaker are higher than the downloads, because the majority of my downloads come not through the RSS feed that Spreaker is hosting, but through the RSS feed on my website and the media that's hosted through my podcast hosting company I've chosen. So what I see in Spreaker is a small portion of my audience. And it makes sense that the behavior on the Spreaker platform is more to play than to download. Similarly with Stitcher and certain other platforms, the behavior may be more to stream instead of to download. So it's okay that the numbers are skewed like that. Make sure, though, that you've submitted your podcast to other podcast apps and directories. Minister Rik Rowley asked, how do I get my podcast to iHeartRadio and iTunes? This ties nicely with Spreaker because Spreaker is one of two popular ways to get your podcast onto iHeartRadio. So Spreaker, if you host with Spreaker or you put your podcast even automatically importing into Spreaker, you do have to have a paid plan though. But for now, you have to have a paid plan on the Spreaker side. You can enable a particular show to then be published over to iHeartRadio. That's really cool because then if you're using Spreaker like Scott Orr is, then it's a very simple step to get your podcast submitted to iHeartRadio. But it may cost extra if you're not already hosting with Spreaker. So the next option would be Libsyn, Libsyn. If you use Libsyn to host your media and create your RSS feed, or at least you can create an RSS feed on your Libsyn account, then Libsyn provides an option for you to submit to iHeartRadio through them. Even if you're using PowerPress on your own site, you can go over to Libsyn and adjust things so that your RSS feed on Libsyn and your iHeartRadio destination are the way that you want them to be. And then you can contact Libsyn to ask them to submit your podcast to iHeartRadio. Be prepared, though, to wait a very long time and possibly really have to fight in order to get your podcast on iHeartRadio. The first thing to know is if your podcast has any music whatsoever, you'll have a very difficult time getting on iHeartRadio. All of the music that I use for our podcast are licensed to us. We have the rights to use the music. But when I submitted the Audacity to podcast the first time, they said, oh, your podcast contains music. We can't allow that. So then I contacted them. I showed them the license. And then they said, I first had to say, well, the music in the podcast is only the intro and the outro. It's a tiny portion of the overall content. And I'm talking over the music. It's not like I play a full song. The actual portion of music that you hear with no voiceover is maybe 10 seconds. And then they came back and said, well, it's copyrighted music and we can't do that. Then I went back and showed them my license. And there was this back and forth process. I think it took 2 or 3 months to be approved on iHeartRadio. But iHeartRadio is a nice place to be. So you can either get into it by hosting your podcast or at least distributing your podcast through Spreaker. And then it's a simple operation to submit it to iHeartRadio. Or if you host your podcast and create an RSS feed with Libsyn, you can also submit to iHeartRadio through Libsyn. And speaking of getting into podcast apps and directories, the next question comes from Gary. He asked, how do I move my podcast from... Oh, actually, I realized I forgot to answer Rik Rowley's other question. How do I get my podcast to iTunes? This is a really big answer that could be given about how you get your podcast into iTunes or the Apple Podcast app. So I have to cut this down into a very simple explanation, and this will apply to almost any other podcast app as well. To get into Apple Podcasts, you need to have an RSS feed for your podcast. You need to have every episode has its own post in that RSS feed, and the media file is downloadable through a special tag inside of that RSS feed. Now, tools like Libsyn, PowerPress, Blueberry, Spreaker, they can create your RSS feed for you. And so when you upload an episode or you click publish on a new post, it goes automatically into that RSS feed. You don't really have to worry about coding the RSS feed yourself. But then you get a podcast-only RSS feed. So it has no blog posts in it, nothing else other than your podcast episodes. You take that feed, which will be a URL, and if you try and visit it, it'll look like just code to you. And that's fine. It doesn't need to look fancy. But you take that RSS feed URL, a website address, and then you go to podcastsconnect.com. That's with an S in the middle. and log in with your Apple ID. And there's a spot in there to click a plus button, and then you paste in that RSS URL for your podcast. Then they'll go through their checks to make sure that it fits all of their requirements. Like it has the right sized cover art. It doesn't include any profanity in the text. It's properly tagged for certain things. Then you simply wait for approval from Apple when your podcast is in Apple Podcasts, and they'll give you the link then when it is accepted. There are a lot more details along this way, like getting an RSS feed, all of the different ways that you can do that. But if you don't have an RSS feed for your podcast, then you don't actually have a podcast. Like if you're publishing stuff on YouTube, or you are live streaming content on Facebook or Mixler or anything like that, those are shows. They're not podcasts. It's not a podcast until you have an RSS feed and the episodes are downloadable through that RSS feed. So with all of the other technical things to consider, that's a whole course really right there to describe everything about how to make your podcast available and put it into the different directories. So that's why I have to give you the quick overview. You need an RSS feed for your podcast. Every episode needs to be downloadable through different items in that feed, and it needs to have all of these official Apple and Google Play tags inside of it. And then you can submit it to Apple, Google Play Music, and other podcast apps and directories. So now on to Gary's question. Gary said, how do I move my podcast from GarageBand to Libsyn? In GarageBand, GarageBand is a free audio editing program that comes with Mac OS. It's not the best for podcasting. It's really designed for music, but it can be used for podcasting. So the simplest way to do this is when you've got your episode all edited together and you have your effects the way you want them and all of that is done, then go to the Share menu and choose Export Song to Disk. Unfortunately, GarageBand doesn't give you the option to make an MP3 file in mono, even if your audio in GarageBand is mono. Maybe I'm missing something somewhere, but all I see is the option to save it in medium quality, low quality, high quality. Of these options, choose 128 kilobits per second, which would be what they call medium quality as an MP3. You save that somewhere on your computer where you can get to it, like your desktop, your podcast folder, something like that. And then you have your MP3 that you publish to Libsyn or whoever is hosting your podcast media. And then they will take care of putting that maybe in your RSS feed if you have them create your RSS feed as well. Or you can tie that into your PowerPress feed or whatever tool you're using. But once you have that MP3 file, then you can upload it to those different places. You could also use Share, and there's an option that's something like export to iTunes. That gives you a bit more control over certain things like the ID3 tags and some of the other stuff. If you are doing this through iOS and a mobile device, then it's a little bit more cumbersome. Probably what you'd need to do is export it to Dropbox on your iOS device, and then from Dropbox, share it to some FTP program that can go into your Libsyn account. It's a little bit cumbersome to do it through iOS, but there might be some other workflows that you could work with there. From the chat, Steve Sleeper said, Daniel, I've got a podcast network, sort of one-off hosting and publishing, but one of the big four built it for me. It works fine, but I have to pay to make changes. So the to come Apple Podcast tags, I'd have to figure out something with them to add that. What if I didn't add the tags? Will that be an issue with my Apple Podcast RSS feed? So it sounds like Steve is hosting his own website with WordPress, and it's created, the separate podcast feeds are created by PowerPress. And the latest version of PowerPress, as long as you update your website to support PowerPress 7.1, you update the plugin on the site, then all of these new Apple Podcast tags are now available to you inside of that. You simply need to enable them for your podcast. So you can do that by going into PowerPress settings, then go to the episode tab, and in there are the options to enable the new season and episode number tags, and also the option to enable the episode title tag. And then over in the iTunes tab, is the option to enable or to change the show type, which would be episodic or serial. Libsyn, if you use Libsyn to create your RSS feed, because Steve is just now saying, no, it's not PowerPress. So if you use Libsyn to create your RSS feed for your podcast, then they, as of today, maybe it's not even available, but they did say they would be launching it today, July 24th. You can now add those additional iTunes tags, Apple Podcast tags inside of your feed through Libsyn. If you're using anything else to generate your RSS feed, you may not have access to these new tags. The episode number, the season number, episode title, stuff like that. So, do you need to add these new tags? Probably not. The way they designed these tags makes it so that you could change nothing about your workflow. And for most of the podcasts out there, it won't negatively affect your show. So like for the episodic versus serial type, well, most of us have episodic shows. And the differentiating factor here is what order do you want people to consume your episodes? Is it okay if they just pick up with the most recent episode and continue on with your new episodes? Or do they have to go back to an episode 1 of either your overall show or your individual season? If you want them to go back to download an old episode first, and you want them to consume chronologically, that's when you choose a serial show, SERIAL. If you're fine with them consuming the latest episode and cherry picking what they want here and there in your archive, then episodic is fine. Episodic is the default. And by default, your podcast won't have seasons assigned to it either, unless you enable that feature. But not many podcasters podcast in actual seasons with separate season numbers and such. So if you do nothing with your RSS feed, it's fine. If you have a TV show fan podcast, maybe that's a better reason to add the seasons to your show. Or if you want to take advantage of the new way the episode numbers display inside of Apple Podcasts when iOS 11 is released later this year, then you could go back and edit your old episodes. But otherwise, it's not going to hurt you, most likely, to not change anything yet. Many shows won't need to change anything at all because the defaults will be fine for their shows. Now, if you're using a tool or a company for generating your podcast feed and they don't have these new tags and the updates available by the time the iOS 11 is released, leave that company because it shows that they're not keeping up with the industry and not keeping up with what they need, or at least if they haven't promised that they would be available extremely soon. But really, it's available now. Developers can implement these new tools now. That's why PowerPress 7.1 now supports these things. Libsyn, as of today, is supporting these new tags, even though it's not available in iOS 11 yet. But you can start getting ready. You can start editing your back archive of episodes, or you can start changing your workflow. That's great that they've made it available. You won't see that yet unless you're running the iOS 11 beta. But if a company hasn't taken that initiative to add that support, it might not be a good company to stick with. Jake Gingerich asked, am I required to register a trademark or business name or anything? Or can I just give my podcast a name and start uploading? I plan on talking about current events and local politics, things like that. Well, Jake, you don't have to register a trademark or business name, anything like that for a podcast. I do recommend, though, that you first search Apple Podcasts to see if anyone else is using the same name for a podcast, because if they are, they might have trademarked it. You trademark names and logos, you copyright content and intellectual property. So you don't have to register a trademark. Someone else may, though, so you should certainly check for that, see if they're claiming it. Even if you don't register a trademark, you can still claim something as a trademark. That's when you see the little TM or a little R with a circle around it. The regular TM is an indicator that you are claiming that as a trademark. The R with the circle around it is an indicator that it's a registered trademark with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, that is. So you can start using that TM symbol without having to register your trademark at all. And it is even defendable. Now, it's not as defendable as if you actually registered the trademark, because if you're registered, then they can just pull that record and say, oh yeah, you registered it at this date. This other person is infringing on your trademark. They came after you registered it. But even if you don't register, you may still be able to protect your trademark by saying, look, I've been using this for 10 years. People recognize me by this trademark, and now you're violating that. But if you come into a situation like that, you really should consult a lawyer for their expert advice. Do you need to register a business name? Well, if you're running a business, yes. If your podcast is the business, yes. If your podcast is part of your business, well, your business should probably be registered anyway. Check your local laws for that. But you don't have to register the podcast if it's a hobby or even if it's an aspect of your already registered business. Like the Audacity to Podcast, that's the name most people know me and my business by, but that's actually not the name of my business. My business name is actually D. Joseph Design LLC. That's the registered name. The Audacity to Podcast is simply something I do. But with all things legal, definitely consult a lawyer if you have more concerns with this, and check to make sure you are not infringing on anyone else's rights when you release your content or name of your podcast. Back to the chat room. Jeremy Dennis said, hi, Daniel. I have an informal network of a couple shows and any additional shows my co-hosts and I do. We have a network page in iTunes, but it only includes shows I added myself. Is it possible to add shows with another iTunes ID to our network page? Yes, it is. You need to contact Apple for that. You go to podcastconnect.com and they have a contact option for you to be able to contact them if you search for especially provider page. So there are different things with Apple, and most likely what you have is called a provider page, where they've collected multiple podcasts and put them together on the same page. And so that way, when people click on your podcast name, they see other podcasts that you do. The other podcasts that aren't owned by you, you might be able to still ask Apple to include those on the same provider page, even though they were submitted with a different Apple ID. And it doesn't change anything as far as stats or ownership. It just groups them together a little bit differently. And that's pretty easy for the Apple team to do, but give them patience when you ask them to do that. And what they'll want to know is the URL for those other podcasts, or that ID number inside of the URL for those other podcasts that should be included. And it would probably help if whoever owns those other podcasts contacts Apple through the email address inside of that RSS feed, or the email address that was used to submit those podcasts to the network. Like that way it would prevent the issues of, well, you're asking us to put this in your network or your provider page, but it doesn't look like you own it. So if the person who does actually own the shows contacts Apple, that'll make it a lot easier to do. And you just say, would you please add these to this particular provider page, and give them a link to that. Those provider pages, though, aren't all that popular. Not a lot of people will browse there. Like with my own podcast, I have Noodle.mx Network, and I have a special thing that lets me put different podcasts on our page and arrange them in a different way. And people don't search Apple Podcasts for Noodle.mx Network. They search for the podcast name. Same thing like with certain Star Trek podcasts. They search for Star Trek, not Trek.fm. Or they search for Grammar Girl, not Quick and Dirty Tips. So although you can make a provider page, and it's kind of nice to have, it might be a potential thing you can link people to on your website to say, check out all of our podcasts in Apple Podcasts by clicking here. It's not really that popular. So thanks for the question, Jeremy. Damien asked, I was wondering if you would consider hosting on WordPress.com under a tier that allows you to use your own domain name to be just as good as using WordPress.org and paying another host service to run it, assuming you don't feel you need the extra features that a .org installation gives you. So, back up. There's WordPress.com and there's WordPress.org. These are both running WordPress. WordPress.com is hosted by the company or a company behind WordPress. Automatic is the name of that company. This is where they host the site for you. You get no extra features like plugins that you can add yourself. You can choose certain features. You can choose certain themes, but they're hosting it for you. It's really nice with WordPress.com that they do that then you don't have to mess with hosting and security and updates. They do that all for you. But you get very little control over the flexibility of your site. Like if you like what you hear about PowerPress, you can't add PowerPress to a WordPress.com site. Or if there's a social sharing plugin you want to use, you can't add that to your site. You're limited to what they allow you to do. Whereas with WordPress.org, it's hosted on your own site, like on SiteGround.com, Bluehost, something like that. And there you have total control over it. You're maintaining both the security and the updates. And you can add whatever plugins or themes that you want. So if you're mapping your own domain in either case, in WordPress.com, I think it's $22 or $27 a year, lets you add your own domain. So then instead of it being like myawesomepodcast.wordpress.com, it would be simply myawesomepodcast.com. Definitely do that if you go the WordPress.com route. So that way, if you ever switch to your own site, that works for you. But I do more highly recommend going the .org route and hosting it on your own web hosting service that you pay for, because then you get so much more control. You can add whatever features you want. You can use PowerPress. You can use Libsyn. You can do all kinds of things that you can't do on the WordPress.com side. It does mean a little bit more maintenance, but it's not all that much more. What you can't do on WordPress.com at all is create a podcast RSS feed. You'd have to use something else to create that. Either use Libsyn or use FeedBurner, which is not really a good idea for adding the podcast information through FeedBurner. It just doesn't work really well on the WordPress.com side. So I do still recommend WordPress.org so that you can own your own platform and do what you want with it. Jason E. Norris in the chat room asked, what do you think is the best tool/service for creating a podcast network site? In other words, your site is your central hub. Everything is accessible there, including the individual RSS feeds for each show. Is there anything out there that makes it easy for each show to have their own page that displays both podcasts and blog posts? I did an episode about this a while back. The way I'm running my podcast network is with what's called WordPress multi-site. So it's a single installation of WordPress, but it's powering multiple websites, all from the same database, the same WordPress installation, and they share many of the same plugins too. Like I can network activate a plugin so that PowerPress, for example, I install it once, I click network activate, and then it's activated on a dozen different websites. WordPress multi-site is a bit more technical to set up, though. The benefits of it are that simpler management, activating, deactivating, updating plugins, themes, and such, then propagates through the entire network. I have a single username and password across all of these sites. There are some other tools that can integrate with the multi-site to be able to support cross-posting or cross-linking, simplified and automatic cross-linking between certain things. Some of them haven't been updated in a while, though. Others are nicely updated. But then as far as like for my own site, Noodle.mx, the website for Noodle.mx used to use some of these multi-site tools that would automatically pull in the latest episodes from each of the subsites and then display them on the main site. I stopped doing that because I decided wasn't really adding that much value. And so now when you go to Noodle.mx, it's a very simple site that shows the different cover art and titles for the different podcasts. You click on that, and then you see the links to the separate things, like the RSS feed, the iTunes, the website link, and such. That can be done with any kind of WordPress site where you're putting in images, you're linking to a separate website. You can even embed certain things like use Simple Podcast Press or Smart Podcast Player to embed a playlist of episodes that are powered by a different website's RSS feed. You can do that without WordPress multi-site. It depends on how complicated or simple you want this all to be. And simply linking to it, then you don't have to go the complicated route. Some plugins don't work well with multi-site. Like I've seen plugins that won't allow you to network activate it. You have to individually activate it on each site. That's a bit annoying. Otherwise, there could sometimes be weird problems. I've also seen plugins, premium plugins, that just aren't aware of multi-site. So you pay for the plugin and it says like one domain or one website, but you can't activate it on multiple sites. And some of these plugins are designed to allow multi-site. Some of them don't even know what to do with multi-site. So it can get complicated to work with. I wouldn't recommend it for everyone or that many people, especially the setup for it is quite complicated. It's easier now than it was years ago when I first set up multi-site. But if you want the easiest route, simply have a separate website for every podcast and then a network site that links to all of these separate websites. So thanks for the question, Jason. Craig Wieland asked, hey, Daniel, what keeps you motivated on days when you don't feel like working on your business? I also work at home and struggle with discipline. I struggle often with the motivation, and especially after days when I feel like I've worked all day long and got nothing accomplished. Now, I no longer work from home. I rent office space now, and that's been hugely beneficial to me and my business and my family for me to have my business now outside of the house. It's nice to have a commute, I've realized, because as an entrepreneur, Gary Vaynerchuk in his book Crush It, I think, put this really well. I don't remember the exact thing he said, but he said that being an entrepreneur is so different from being an employee. And some people just don't get it when they look at us, because for us as entrepreneurs, our work is our play. It's not like work-life balance. They're integrated with each other. We work in our life. Our life is in our work. And so, and that's not to say that we can't have boundaries. Let me say that without so many negatives. That's not to say that boundaries are impossible. You do need boundaries, especially when you're working from home. And that was, for me, where I and my wife struggled largely when running my business from home for several years, is it was very difficult to honor and maintain those boundaries in multiple ways. So moving the business to outside of the house, renting office space, has been huge for that. And the commute then gives me that transition time so that I can transition from work mode to home mode, so that when I get home, I'm not thinking of, oh, I want to write this email, or I want to develop this special course or something like that. So how do I get motivated? Well, for one thing, having a space where the only thing I do in that space is work really helps. Whether that be a room in your house or it's some place that you rent. If you use your computer for recreational use, like many of us do, Facebooking, playing games, watching videos, whatever, as much as possible, do that kind of thing away from that space, so that that particular space is dedicated only to work, podcasting, whatever your work is. So that way, when you're in that space, you know, this is my work zone. That helps a little bit there. The other thing that really helps to keep me motivated when I don't feel like working is just to start. I share this illustration often. When I was a kid, I hated bath time because I just didn't want to be interrupted. I didn't want to take a bath. I didn't want to get clean. Cleaning, was for sissies. I was a little boy and I didn't mind being dirty and I didn't feel like I was dirty anyway. I hated baths. It was just such an interruption, a time waster and such to me. I absolutely hated baths. But then once I got in the bath, I started playing with the bubbles and all of that fun stuff, building things, giving myself a beard, diving through the bubbles and all that stuff. You could hardly get me out of the bathtub because I loved baths. So the perspective here is just get doing it. And in a way, it's kind of like fake it till you make it, but you're not really faking it. You are forcing yourself. You're disciplining yourself to take action even when you don't feel like it. And then you'll get into the groove. And there could be other things, though. I've done some episodes actually fairly recently about motivation or about keeping energy. What was that episode? The audacitytopodcast.com/ it's not on the front page anymore. I don't remember what episode number it was anymore. But the point is to get into podcasting, get into that flow. Oh, okay. Episode 311. I think it's the audacitytopodcast.com/reignite. The title is How to Reignite Your Passion in Podcasting, episode 311. And in there, I give some tips on reigniting that passion. And that could be a daily thing. Like today you feel like podcasting, tomorrow you don't. Or today you feel like working, tomorrow you don't. So I give some tips in that episode that'll help you. And Craig asked as a follow-up, are you more productive now that you have external office space? Yes, I am. Sometimes, though, I'm very inspired having this space because of what I can do in this space. Sometimes that becomes a problem where I can spend all day working, but at the end of the day, I feel like I don't know what I accomplished because I was working all day on something I don't know. And even today, I spent several hours doing something and look back realizing, wait, what was I doing? Several hours have gone by and I didn't accomplish certain things I wanted to. So you have to build in discipline and start small. Get into that groove and look for those patterns that help you to know when I do this, then I feel motivated, or I feel motivated more around these particular times or in this particular environment, or when I have this particular routine. Like one of the things I look forward to now every day is, now this is my old logo, but every morning I'll get a nice cup of tea. I hate coffee. I'll make tea for myself. And that's part of my morning routine. And it's kind of relaxing to have something that is totally routine. Sometimes when I really need to conquer emails in my inbox, I'm working from a laptop computer. So I will disconnect my laptop computer. I'll take it over to my standing desk and I'll stand over there while I'm answering emails. And that helps me to focus, just kind of that mental shift of going to a different place with the sole purpose of accomplishing a certain task. Derek Grosskirth asked, how many views should I be getting per episode before I try to find sponsors or companies as sponsors? It really depends. Instead of thinking in numbers, think in terms of relevance and the value of your audience. So to give you some actual numbers, though, companies like someone earlier had asked this. Oh, Derek also asked earlier, should I approach Libsyn or Midroll for ads? Midroll, I think, won't look at you, won't even talk to you, basically, if your podcast doesn't have more than, I think it's now like 25,000 downloads per episode, somewhere basically above 10,000 downloads per episode. And I don't get 10,000 downloads per episode. Places like Podcast One, 50,000 downloads per episode. This is not downloads per month. This is per individual episode. And at numbers that big, then it really makes sense to have these sponsors that pay $10 CPM, like cost per 1,000 downloads. So if you're getting $10 CPM and you have 50,000 downloads per episode, well, that's $500 per episode. 4 episodes in a month, that's $2,000 per month. You could almost live on that. Certainly, that's a nice supplemental income. If you do more than 1 episode per week, then, the more frequently you publish episodes, the more downloads you get, and the more your audience grows. Those things aren't connected, by the way. But the more you publish an episode, the more opportunities there are for sponsors. Some places, like with Libsyn, if you want to talk to Libsyn, and you can, if you host with Libsyn, you can ask them about what advertising things they have available. They have a certain survey they want you to do and certain things because they need to know a little bit more about your audience. But let's take Audible, for example. Libsyn can help you get Audible as a sponsor, but typically they'll be looking at your show only if you have more than 5,000 downloads per episode. And that's kind of the bottom starting point for many of these more popular sponsors. A Libsyn, an Audible, a Casper, a GoToMeeting, a GoDaddy, Squarespace, something like that. They probably want to see at least 5,000 downloads per episode, which you might not have yet. However, you don't have to go to these separate companies. You could negotiate your own sponsorships, or you could work with someone like Jessica Kufferman from JK Media Agency, who can negotiate sponsorships for you and take a little portion of that. But what you can do as an independent podcaster is you can find something that's more relevant for you. Audible provides audiobooks. And I think that's about the most relevant thing that applies to potentially all podcasters and podcast listeners out there. Casper mattresses doesn't apply to every audience. GoToMeeting, GoDaddy, Squarespace, Blue Apron, MeUndies, these different things don't really apply to every audience. And that's not to say that everyone's going commando out there and no one needs underwear from MeUndies. But if, like with my own podcast, a podcast about podcasting, it doesn't make sense for me to advertise for Audible, for MeUndies, for Casper, for Blue Apron, for those kinds of things, because my audience is podcasters. So even if they sleep and wear underwear and eat food, that doesn't make my ad spots immediately relevant to them. So instead of thinking about going for the same sponsors everyone else is going for, think about what kind of company wants your audience. So my audience, for example, is an audience of podcasters. What companies make sense to advertise to an audience of podcasters? Well, podcast hosting companies, transcription service providers, as much as I dislike transcriptions, but I get solicited often for transcription companies to sponsor an episode of the Audacity to Podcast. And I keep saying, no, I don't want a transcription service as a sponsor. I actually don't want sponsors because I promote my own products. There are other service providers that can make sense to be a sponsor for my podcast. I've chosen not to take sponsors, though, anymore because I have my own stuff to sell. I'd rather promote my stuff than someone else's stuff. Or if I mention something, it might have an affiliate link, like Simple Podcast Press or SiteGround or Blueberry or Libsyn, things like that. I can promote with an affiliate link, but I promote them within context. There's no contract I have with them that says I must promote them on this episode and I must deliver this many thousand downloads or anything like that. It's more about I'm recommending it when it's applicable, when it's relevant within context. You can sometimes make more money that way than having an official sponsor spot where it's like, this episode is brought to you by so-and-so company. So think about those companies that make sense to your audience. What kind of things does your audience want, and would they actually be interested in? Because even if your podcast gets 50,000 downloads per episode, and your podcast is about video gaming, for example, and then you get a sponsor like GoDaddy, who specializes in domains and web hosting. Well, 50,000, yeah, certainly some of the 50,000 might be interested, but it's not going to be very profitable for GoDaddy. Now, if Twitch, I could keep going on and on with illustrations, so I'll stop. Find what's relevant to your audience and approach that company. Even if they don't advertise in podcasts, you can tell them about your audience. Tell them, hey, I've got this audience that loves this kind of thing. I think your product is the kind of thing my audience wants. Or you describe your audience to them and they might be thinking, oh, yeah, that's exactly the kind of audience I'd like to advertise in front of. And try and figure out a way that this can be a mutually beneficial relationship, beneficial for you, beneficial for the company, and beneficial for your listeners. See, a lot of these sponsorships of podcasts are beneficial to the podcaster because they get paid for the spot. They're beneficial to the company because the company builds their brand or they get customers, but they may not be beneficial to the audience because the audience may not care. You might need to show numbers to a potential sponsor, but the more important thing is to show the value in your audience. And if you can show that, hey, whenever I mention something, my 95% or 70% of my audience buys it after I mention it, that's more powerful because that shows greater relevance, that shows greater influence. And that's where the value is in sponsorships. I'll answer one last question here. This just came in from Jason E. Norris. He said, pretty link question. If that company stopped updating their plugin, I'm talking about the company behind PrettyLink, or went out of business, does that mean all our links die? Or is it stored somehow, somewhere, so that the links can live on? PrettyLink and PrettyLink Pro, I really recommend the paid Pro version. I have affiliate links to all this stuff, by the way, on my website if you're interested. But PrettyLink creates the links on your website. So even if the company behind PrettyLink died and they're completely gone, and they stopped developing the plugin on your site would still work for the foreseeable future. It's always possible that that WordPress might update something that breaks the plugin, but you could also choose not to run that update. I don't recommend that. So even then, if something else came along to take the place of PrettyLink, they would probably offer a way for you to import all your PrettyLink links into that other thing. Like a while back, Better Links Pro was made by the guy who created EasyAzon Pro. And it had some interesting things about it, but that plugin was not maintained. However, it did include an import from PrettyLink tool. There are even ways that you can export your PrettyLinks from WordPress so that you could change it, re-import them into something else. But if the company went out of business, you still have the plugin on your site. You may not receive updates, so certain things may break later on. But it's not like there's not a big risk in this kind of thing failing. Look at what happened with PodPress. That was the first popular podcasting plugin for WordPress. Everyone was using it in the early days of WordPress. And then at some point, the developer just disappeared and PodPress started breaking. And in the early days of WordPress, it was very easy to make a plugin that would break with the next version of WordPress. Today, it's far less likely that a plugin will break with each update of WordPress because there's much more standardization now. But what Blueberry did is they created then PowerPress, and they made it support all of the PodPress information so that people could very easily transition from PodPress over to PowerPress. And today, if Blueberry completely closed up shop and stopped updating PowerPress, well, two things to keep in mind. One, the plugin still works on your website, and it will probably continue to work for years and years. Two, the data is all in your own database. I said two things, didn't I? I mean three things. But two, the data is all in your own database. So you could use some other plugin. You could change things. You could switch things over probably to something else. And number three, PowerPress in particular is open source. So if it were to die, someone else could come along and create like the next version of PowerPress or take over development for the plugin and keep it updated and working. So I don't think that Pretty Link's going to disappear. Especially, I think they've got a good business model running, and Pretty Link is part of that. So thank you very much for joining me for this live Q&A. The next episode of the Audacity podcast publishes on July 25th, 2017. And that episode is, what is that episode about? I forget now. When I record, last week was the 5 kinds of people who should be in your circle. The week before that was how to get press access for your podcast. This next episode, wow, I am out of touch with my own content. I just recorded it. How to get people to share your podcast. That's the next episode of the Audacity to Podcast. So watch for that at theaudacitytopodcast.com so you can learn how to get people to share your latest episodes and help you grow your podcast. I think that'll be really beneficial for a lot of podcasters out there. So watch for that Tuesday, July 25th at theaudacitytopodcast.com. If you have questions that you would like me to answer during one of these podcasting Q&As, then watch for when I schedule it on Facebook Live, and you can post your question in the comment ahead of time, or contact me through the website at theaudacitytopodcast.com and send your question that way. Keep your questions concise, makes it much easier for me to include inside of these live Q&As. And join me again then on a Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern over at theaudacitytopodcast.com/live. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from The Audacity to Podcast. Thanks for watching.